Hi everyone, my name's Barney Walsh. I'm Senior Lecturer in Security Leadership and Development Education at the African Leadership Centre. I'll quickly pass the chair, Dr. Clement, my friend and colleague, to introduce the event properly, but I just wanted to say thank you for being here on behalf of the African Leadership Centre. Really pleased to host this event, Dr. Haman, and this particular issue. I think especially the ALC at King's has something like, I don't know if it's an image crisis or perception problem where people think we only are interested in Africa and Africans. Yeah, I always say to people, if we were the European Centre for Leadership Studies, no one would think we only cared about Europe or Europeans and that kind of thing. But with the African Leadership Centre, we study the security, development, nexus, and leadership issues across the developing world and entire world. We run the MSc Global Leadership and Peace Building and the MSc Leadership and Development here at King's. We do have an African agenda and our sister centre in ALC Nairobi that runs fellowship programs, the PhD program here at King's in Leadership Studies. But I just wanted to say hello and welcome, and it's particularly pleasing to host this kind of event. And especially these kind of issues, mining and ESG is kind of a complex leadership challenge of our time. Yes, the climate crisis comes into the conversation, but I know actually that's complexified and interlinked with, let me say, more long-term sustainability and governance problems that we kind of have been aware of for some time. So I'm really pleased to have you here. Very, very pleased to see people in the room. I know there's people online as well. Thank you for joining us. But let me pass over to my friend, Dr. Clement, who will introduce the event.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, and welcome everyone. Apologies, I was sorting out the online link. It looks like a few people who registered didn't receive the link. Luckily, some have gotten it, so that's encouraging. Those online, welcome. I can see 10 people online already. That's good. And I'll sort out those who can't join now. And I think that the participation today is encouraging and nice. Thank you. So yes, the ALC research seminar is normally monthly, sometimes depending on how we go during the 10 monthly seminar series we have at the ALC at King's, where we bring scholars around the world, mainly those within the African Leadership Centers network of scholars, and to speak about their research, their ongoing areas of interest, and what the interconnections with Africa, but also around the theme of peace, security, and now climate change and sustainability. This is the 18th we are having in the series, and luckily, even as this is a quiet moment at King's because lectures are over, we've managed to bring Dr. Evan Haman from Australia to be with us today to speak about his research around environment, social, and governance, mainly on climate and sustainability and the environment. Evan is a research fellow and scholar at the Centre of Environmental Governance at the University of Canberra in Australia. Before he went to the University of Canberra, he was University of Queensland, Technology, Queensland University Technology, where together with where he is now, his research focuses mainly on environment, sustainability, but also the law of it, the governance and regulations of environmental sustainability. And today he's going to speak about Australia's role in the global space of environmental sustainability, especially because Evan and I, together with 6 other Australian academics, are working on the issue of trust in critical minerals governance between Australia and Ghana and globally. And this fits within that space of environment, social, and governance of minerals and sustainability. I'll welcome Evan in a moment, but just to say we are excited to have you, Evan, and that we don't take your presence here for granted at all, traveling all the way from Australia to join the here in the UK. So I'll give you the floor. Evan will speak for about 30 minutes, and then you can ask questions where appropriate. Thank you, Evan. I think those online can see the screen. I suspect so. Please, if you can't see the shared screen online, please text and I will let you have it. Okay, all right, good man.
Thank you, Clement. Thank you for the nice introduction. Nice to meet everybody. So Evan Hammond is my name. I felt a bit strange being at the African Leaders Centre, partly because I'm neither African nor a leader, but let's just leave that aside for the moment. In fact, and this is kind of a big learning curve for me, is being involved in a project with Clement that actually touches on African issues. For those of you who aren't familiar with Australia, we actually don't get a particularly good schooling in international issues, let alone African issues. So I suspect most of the students at our university and even at school level, if you asked, point out Burkina Faso on the map, would be unable to do it, even Ghana. And that is a real sort of blight on our educational system and something we need to improve upon. Having said that, we do have some knowledge of other aspects of the global south. So, for example, the South Pacific, which is much closer to Australia, and have done some work on the relationship of communities mining and so forth in the South Pacific, where it's not terrestrial mining, but it's deep sea mining, which is the problems that they're now facing. Anyway, so I'll talk for about 30 minutes. Hopefully it's not too kind of lectury, and I tried to make it when I was writing this presentation, albeit I literally just got off the plane, make it a bit more, what's the word? I guess conversational. So towards the end, when I finish it, we'll try and prompt some ideas or thinking or thoughts that you might have in your own work that could help me with my own research, and vice versa. We'll have that kind of free-flowing discussion. So these are the kind of topics I'm going to talk about. So as I mentioned, I'll talk about ESG for a bit and put that in context. What is ESG? Try and pin it down. Talk a little bit about extractive industry abroad, extractive industry in mining, but that could also include oil and gas, not just the minerals. We'll talk about miners behaving badly. So as all of you are probably aware, to varying degrees, there have been a number of situations where miners have not done the right thing, either illegally, immorally, or by some other standard which we want to hold them to across the world, particularly in developing countries. So their reputation is not good with upgrade. So that legacy is kind of very important for the way in which we currently regulate or approach the issues that exist today across the world. We're talking about some of the self-regulatory or voluntary standards that are out there at the international level that have come through the International Council on Mining and Minerals, but also from the UN and the OECD, organizations like that, as well as some corporate specific commitments. So, for example, Rio Tinto, Shell, and the big name corporations have their own commitments in specific areas or for specific mining ventures, for example, in World Heritage sites or other particular areas. Then I'll get into talk about the Australian regulatory requirements and how Australian mining companies are regulated. So when I say regulated, I'm talking, my background's in law, so I'm talking really from a legal perspective. Can I just get a show of hands on what, if I say regulation, what do you think I mean by regulation? Oh, sorry, I would assume government. Right, yep, so government's fundamental to it.
I would mainly think of laws and some laws passed by government, but there might also be quasi-regulatory things done by industry bodies or companies in terms of code practice.
Yeah, so I suppose if we delve into regulatory theory, regulation talks at those two ends of the spectrum. So it's not necessarily conceived of as just government, although they have the state-held legitimacy to pass legislation and so forth and then enforce it. But there's also all these, what we call self-regulatory, co-regulatory models out there that may exist. So this ESG, to me, really fits within that space. And it's whether sort of thesis that I'm working towards, and I'll get to at the end, would like your views on or thoughts on, is I'm seeing a kind of convergence happen here between these self-regulatory standards and what the governments are trying to regulate, implement, pass laws, and enforce them in response to it. Now, that's very specific to the context of Western wealthy democratic countries, and we'll see that come out in the context of mining. So I'm going to get into it. So these are the things I'm going to talk about in Australian context: bribery and corruption, modern slavery, and the new climate disclosure and other material risks. And then we'll talk about some examples in the EU where they've gone a step further than Australia has in a regulatory sense, in places like Germany and Norway, introducing due diligence legislation, not just for mining, but for corporations that exceed a certain limit of turnover and employees, and as well as the EU due diligence directive, which has just gone into place, I believe. So, ESG, it's a bit of an amorphous space. When we talk ESG, it's really a phenomenon that, as far as I can see through the research I've done, has evolved in the last 2 decades. So prior to that, you may have heard of concepts: corporate sustainability, it's corporate social responsibility, triple bottom line accounting, these types of concepts, right, have culminated in what is, I believe, has become the kind of front runner of this language, which is ESG. So around about 2004, 2005 onwards, it was taken up by the United Nations in certain pockets, and then really driven in the last, say, 10 years by the finance industry, right? So we're talking big capital investments. Are the investments we're making somehow consistent with these factors? Now, these factors, if you look at them on the list, you'd say, wow, they're kind of, well, I might ask you, what jumps out at you when you look at these factors on the list? And bear in mind, this is only one sort of incarnational view of what ESG is or could be.
I mean, they don't really all work together, they're all quite different, and they can often conflict with each other.
Yeah, so there's an interrelationship, but the whole notion of ESG sort of assumes that they're kind of isolated.
And you could be fantastic in one and terrible in the others. And you know, you could be, your social policies of the company could be fantastic, it could be regional environmental habit. So it's hard to get a metric which works across the 3 silos, 3 spheres.
Yeah, fantastic. Yep. Anybody else? Yes.
What financial capitalism delivers. So legal standards, you'd expect that to be like shareholder value investments and that right down. Some about kind of finance.
That's right. And so the sort of language in at least in the US debates, has turned on this idea that somehow stakeholder capitalism, shareholder capitalism. So your shareholders of the corporation now have a bigger say in how the investments that they're making are actually changing the world to make it better or not better. But they're these big asset managers like BlackRock and so forth, which control a lot of power in the way in which companies are actually run each year, putting forward through what are called proxy advisors, resolutions to the board that they behave in a particular way. There's actually this influence going through the flow of capital in society. So that's one view. That's kind of the democratic, progressive view. On the other side, and if you're interested, there is a very good debate that happened in one of the committees in the US. I forget the name of the committee. In about July last year, went for a few days, where the progressives and the Republicans were against each other about whether ESG is just woke capitalism, which is obviously the Republican side, saying, look, why are we doing this? Why are corporations making decisions that influence all those big social issues that we had before? And then on the Democratic side, it came back to in the arguments they tried to make, well, this is actually about good data. It's about having good information, the right information, so companies can make the right financial decisions in the longer term. Because if you went back to that previous slide, you would see that most of those things are risks to a business, right? So when it's a risk to a business, it's either going to be reputational or financial, operational, all those combined. So shareholders are going to want to have that information in front of them when they're making investments. So that's the path that it's kind of converging upon. The other thing I could probably ask you is, do we have laws on these things already? Like in the UK, for example? Apparently, most of them.
Theoretical.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Theoretically, I think.
Yeah, so, I mean, which ones in particular can you think of, just looking at them?
Corruption.
Right, there's something, like, you've got a Bribery Corruption Act in the UK, Bribery Act 2007, something like that.
Yeah.
There are things on energy efficiency in some realms, not all.
So some are kind of halfway there, some are kind of definitely, like I'm pretty sure you would have something on air and water pollution.
Yeah,
Whether it gets enforced or not, you know, we have the same issues in Australia and of course, you know, in Africa, it's probably next level above that, right? Is a different question. But what I'm suggesting here is something really interesting at play, you know, we've already got measures in which the law has made a response to these particular issues. Then we've got ones where it's kind of done something, but perhaps not enough. And then we've got ones that are probably in the third category, which is nothing at all. So gender and diversity, do you think there's any laws around that?
Well, what do we mean by gender and diversity? Because even for me, looking at this, I'm struck by the fact that you mentioned of Indigenous peoples. Even though a lot of natural resources and climate change is specifically affecting Indigenous peoples, and to my understanding, this is the case in Australia. So when I looked at gender and diversity, at first my first thought was, do we mean diversity like LGBTQ plus, or is that where Indigenous people are put in, and why are they not explicitly named?
Yeah, and I think that's where we've ended up, is that the sort of vagaries of ESG and the ways in which we've got these reporting frameworks has allowed the companies to pinpoint which areas are good at and which ones are not so good at. So something like, you know, and I don't know whether this is actually beneficial trying to break it down into these individual categories or not. It may be that it's not. But that if you look at some reporting around, for example, human rights, they'll wrap up their Indigenous rights, cultural heritage issues under the banner of human rights. Others might ignore it altogether and wrap up later standards within human rights. Data protection and privacy, well, privacy is a human right in and of itself as well. So that you get a lot of interrelationship, I think was the point you were making before. And the fact that we don't have legal frameworks around this allows for, or taxonomies is the other thing that's getting thrown around at the moment. Ways in which we can hold corporate accounting or reporting on these issues into account. The influence of trade. I mean, this is something I wasn't aware of until relatively recently. The EU is driving a lot of these ESG issues. Why? I don't fully understand that picture. I mean, in a progressive place, smaller, you know, middle power like Australia, Canada, these sorts of nations, we take our cues from the bigger players. Having worked in the parliament the last couple of years, I saw how we would wait until the EU did something, the UK did something, and then we would sit a couple of years and then we'd adjust slightly with our new Modern Slavery Act or our new ESG directive or whatever it may be. It's been interesting what's happening. We've not yet got since you guys left the EU, we have to renegotiate all these trade agreements, right? So we've not yet concluded ours with the EU, but New Zealand has. And the EU is very strong on these kind of ESG issues, if you want to encapsulate them like that. So you're getting this incredible trade influence into the agreements that are being made with certain countries, not all. But if you want to do business with us and you want to sign up to an agreement with us for trade, then you're going to have to agree to these very particular ESG, sustainability, animal welfare practices, right? So there's another influence coming on the domestic level. So at the Australian government's level, well, we're now required to say this was Australia, have regulations in place about animal welfare, which we may or may not have had before. If you went into good regulatory practices or transparency, probably things about privacy. The EU is big on that. So we're getting this kind of, I suppose, influence from the EU through trade as well. Right, let's go to mining quickly. So we all know that mining is a risky business. Doesn't have to be, but historically it has been. So the global mining industry is characterized by risks of high pollution, high energy consumption, and financial fragility. Financial fragility point's interesting because it's the work Clement and I are looking at with the extraction of critical minerals being lithium, in this case in Africa. The price of critical minerals has done what? Well, lithium in particular in recent years, or sorry, recent months. Yeah, it's plummeted, right? So it went through the roof as we all started buying electric cars and in all the batteries and so forth, but then it plummeted. And so you've got this kind of financial fragility to something like critical minerals, which perhaps didn't really exist 100 years ago when we were talking about coal. We need to dig up coal, we've got the Industrial Revolution, that these coal mines are going to be approved for 100 years. We're going to be in that community for the next 50 years. The lithium producers may come in. They may or may not be, there could be a speculative investment. So these issues around ESG are very context dependent upon the mineral, upon the place that you're going, and the backers of the financial backers of your project. Some recent research, there have been improvements in the quantity and quality of mining companies' ESG disclosure in recent years. Mining companies in developing countries publish ESG reports, but the mining company is lower. That's not surprising. Environmental disclosures are more impactful in developing countries and social disclosures in developed countries, which I found kind of fascinating. So if we go back to our table of ESG, bear in mind, no one's really talking about this stuff, right? They're talking about these two columns mainly. Right, so they're saying in developing countries, well, it's the environment stuff that we're doing well. Yeah, we extracted lithium, we haven't polluted the local waterway. We're not going to tell you anything about our gender and diversity and what we're doing there. Right? It's in the too hard basket for now. But if we're reporting on something we're doing in Australia, yes, we've got X amount of women on the board. We've engaged with our employees on a daily basis. We give them 3 days a year for charity days off, so on and so forth, right? So kind of interesting research that's been done there. So a lot of examples of environmental disputes or abuses across the world, not just related to environment. And of course, in your work, you think of many others as well. Right, so I want to move quickly towards the end so we can get to a bit of a discussion. We have these kind of self-regulatory standards. So this is where kind of ESG and the mining industry are at the moment. So ESG, going back a step, is not just related to the mining industry. It affects all corporate organizations, right? It's a way, it's an influence, it's a way of influencing private corporations to effectively be better corporate citizens, right? So it doesn't just apply to mining. But in the mining context, in particular, we've got these two non-binding sets of principles or guidelines. You must do the right thing by local communities. You can imagine the flavour of the language in all these. Then you've got some OECD level principles and the UN. And then also, if you step back and look at the financial aspects which are driving the investment in mining, you get some non-binding industry frameworks as well. Now, when you look into all of these, the language is, what would you expect the language to be? And this is important, right? I think where this is heading, and particularly for me, who, as being a lawyer, language is important. Right? It's all good and well to say we've got principles, but where do they begin and end? And what standards do we pick up? And I suppose it goes to your point before about just words on a page, gender and diversity. Well, what does that mean? So what would you expect if you look through this?
So far, as I like the ISI, it's all about like showing that you've been through the correct procedures and being able to document that you've been through the correct procedures so that other agencies or other stakeholders can then do due diligence and say, well, we checked that they've done the correct procedures. So if something goes wrong, it's not happening. Right. So that's this one, the Transparency Initiative in particular. So very process-based, very tick a box.
So I think there's often a conflict between ones that are very principles-based, which can be very high level.
Yeah.
Think of the SDGs or whatever else.
Yeah.
And then things which are very process-based, which need you down a more due diligence compliance mindset.
Yes.
And then it can be more tick boxy. And often it's quite difficult to find something which gives you the guidance to blend the two.
100%, I agree with you. Yeah, and I do find that interesting from a which is more effective point of view as well. You know, maybe the middle road is the one we need to get more towards. We've actually got measures, and we were talking earlier about this, that the way in which ESG and regulation thereof has sort of unfolded in the last 2 decades is towards more disclosure-based regimes, right? So effectively what it does, if you look through all these regimes, the one you've got in the UK with sustainability reporting, the one we're about to do in Australia, the one that the United States have tried to do, Japan has tried to do it, I think some other, Singapore is another. They marry up the current corporate reporting with sustainability reporting. So you already got obligations to report to your shareholders, right? Yeah, and annually, right? These are your financial reports. But in addition to that, we want non-financial reporting, we want sustainability reporting, we want a director's report. We want you to talk about all the risks that you did or that you faced during the year and how you dealt with them. This all disclosure-based stuff. And to your point, it's very ticker-boxy, isn't it? Tell us what you did and how you dealt with it. And not only that, you get to decide how you present it. So, is anyone legally trained in this room? A lawyer? Have you ever heard the saying in contract law that he or she who drafts wins? It makes sense, right? If you can control that process, the more you can control the language, the more you can control what you put out there, how you manage the risk and so forth. So this is a sort of a big problem as I see it with the push towards disclosure-based regimes. I'm just going to move a bit more quickly towards Australia because I've only got a few minutes left. So we've got company-specific pledges. So in addition to self-regulatory models, if you go on these corporations' websites, you'll see all sorts of things saying, we will not do this, we will do this. In Rio Tinto, which is one of the world's biggest mining companies, which was just talking to the lady before about their situation in Australia in a place called Juukan Gorge, where they destroyed some caves that were 40,000 plus years old. They tried to rebrand themselves or trying to scramble to make themselves look like a better corporate citizen, especially in the mining sense. So they've been pushed. But interestingly here, you can see, so this is March 2024, right? In response to engagement with investors and civil society organisations, we have to annual general meetings, including consideration of a proposal tabled by the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. So you have these groups, you have these activist shareholders, you have these proxy organisations who are putting pressure on the corporations through annual general meetings and so forth to take a stance on these issues. We have decided to enhance disclosure on the plans to reduce our Scope 3 emissions. What are Scope 3 emissions? Does anyone know?
Then couple down the track, it's sort of not your own immediate production, but it's how your production might be used on it in other places.
Exactly.
Or how you might use this way, you might use goods that are produced in your corporation, how that chain back that way as well.
Right. So it's
very complicated.
It's complicated. It's a few steps removed, right? But Scope 3 emissions, in terms of reporting on climate data, are the big issue, right? Because it's not enough for Rio Tinto, who produces iron ore in Australia, right? Like it's our biggest export by far. It dwarfs things like, so if we didn't have iron ore in Australia, we'd be, well, opportunity cost, right? You know what we would have invested in had we not just dug this stuff out of the ground, but we nowhere near the wealth that Australia would have, right? It dwarfs everything else. And Rio Tinto is the biggest exporter of iron ore. Iron ore is used in steel production, right? So as long as China keeps building buildings and so forth, our iron ore keeps feeding that. So that's what we're talking about with Scope 3 though, right? So here's the iron ore. We only disclosed on how many emissions it came from the ground when we extracted the iron ore. Full stop. That's Scope 1. We might look at the trucks that took the iron ore to and from the port. That's Scope 2. But when it gets to China and they start building gigantic skyscrapers and all that, we're not looking at that. That's not our problem. That's in China's mission. So if you're looking at reporting on emissions, this is where it's all headed, right? So the better models, the better regulatory models will take that into account and force corporations to look at those things. Here's the other interesting point in the whole ESG mining debate, that mining is dominated by several countries and has been for the last 100 years. Australia, South Africa, Canada, the United States, Russia, before the went under in the first incarnation. Brazil, several countries, right? In a place like Latin America, I think Canadian mining companies account for something like 60% of all operations. So this is enormous, right? So increasingly we're seeing China play a bigger role. So what's going to be the difference between the corporations we're talking here, Glencore, the headquarters here somewhere in London? What's going to be the difference between these corporations and say China? In terms of the ownership and running of the corporation. Private versus public ownership or state-owned ownership. So when you have these issues of ESG, and if I go back to that International Council on Minerals and Metals, ICMM, which is that big group of relevant principles, there are all these sorts of companies, right, that have signed up to those pledges and those commitments. You're not seeing the state-owned Chinese corporations in there. And I'm not suggesting it's a bad thing or not, I'm just saying that's the fact of the matter, right? So then you've got ESG affecting certain private institutions in the mining space, but not others. So state ownership of the minerals industry. So that has been, I suppose, declining in recent years, and part of that's from the fall of the Soviet Union. But Chinese state ownership continues. These are other countries with significant state ownership states: China, Chile, India, Iran, and Poland. Mineral specific as well. So state control varies by metal, with some metals like bauxite and zinc having up to 90% state ownership. Okay, I'm just going to talk about Australia and then I'm going to finish. So Australia, as I kind of said before, is a bit of a conservative place. We don't like to be a leader in changing laws, although I think we were the first country in the world to give women the vote. But apart from that, that was 100 plus years ago. We've been pretty slow on being leaders in a regulatory space. That doesn't mean in certain technological spaces we're not leaders. So, for example, in the mining space, we have been. A really good example of this is software. So mining exploration software. I think roughly 60% of the software, 60-70% of the software that's out there at the moment has been developed by Australian companies. So that's a big step from a relatively small player. Albeit in the mining space, Australia is a big player. But regulation-wise, we've been a bit slow on the uptake, right? Bribery and corruption. So you've got your Bribery Act 2010, I think it is. And I'm talking about bribery and corruption not happening here in the UK, but happening overseas in order to win a contract, right? In order to get something through the government. This is a massive issue. The UK has an offence that says if you or your associate engaged in bribery, and this is just me paraphrasing, right? Then we can fine you as well. Right? A number of cases over the years, including household names for the UK. Where was it? Rolls-Royce, right? And these fines are enormous. When I looked at these fines, and they show you on the state fraud organisation, I forget the name of the organisation, on their website, they show you the fines that have been agreed to by these companies. They're almost €1 billion. I think they're in the billions. They're extraordinary, right? Yeah, the companies will pay the fines, and get on with business. But interestingly, they have these things called deferred prosecution agreements. So the point about monitoring and enforcement, which was sort of raised before, how hard is it to enforce a law on bribery in a different country? It would be, I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there. How hard do you think it would be? Extremely hard, right? Why is it so hard? What are some of the things that make it so difficult? Let's just talk maybe Africa or.
I mean, I'd say Brazil is proving the thing. And cultural content, even what you call bribery and this is how you do business. And yeah, what we call the UK is good at pulling other countries to work. Site it doesn't count if that money's buying other properties or it's all bad. Yeah, how to even define it.
Exactly, and the kind of names we give to these things, if happens elsewhere, like the kind of this capture you get somewhere else. It happens in the UK, it's called lobbying.
Yeah.
This kind of thing. So it's-
So it comes back to the words on the page and how we pin people or organizations down for the commitments that they make or not make. In that sense. And then you've got the kind of the very practical issues of getting people to provide evidence, provide a statement that you took that money. Where's the money trail? There was none. It was all cash in hand, blah, blah, blah. But the interesting cultural point that you made about, well, in some countries, this is just how we do business.
Yeah.
That's what I find fascinating, because if you go back to the ESG slide, right, we've got all these principles and things we want to make fantastic in the world. Environmental destruction, we can kind of all agree on that one. That's a bad thing, right? Wherever you are in the world. Gender and diversity. Yeah, yes and no, right? Different cultures, different places, different ways of dealing with things, right? Bribery and corruption, again, right? Whistleblowers, so you look in the governance column, I'm sorry I don't have it up here, but you see this kind of very Western approaches to what we conceive of as being important in society. I'm not saying things are more important than others or whatever, I'm just purely pointing that out, right? Which means that when you get past the, we've already got laws for these things, modern slavery, I think we can probably all agree that that's probably a bad thing, right? Child labor, that's also bad. But those are the easy ones, so to speak. I don't mean easy as in like child labor, but easy as in we can all agree it's really bad conduct, let's regulate. When you start getting towards the more, morally, culturally difficult ones, that's when you have more an issue. Anyway, so I also find that fascinating. And incidentally, the way the Australian laws try to deal with it is to say, unless in the country that you're doing the business, that particular practice is specifically provided for in their law. So unless it says, when you're doing business in Ghana, it's okay to take money from chief officer in order to get money in return. It has to be written down. Is that the case? Very unlikely, right? Anyway, so what's happened? I think going to your point about, and this is the last little bit I make, but not the discussion. In terms of enforcement, you have these things called deferred prosecution agreements. What are they? What do you think they might be?
We're going to court.
Avoid going to court. All of these situations, and in the millions, I'm pretty sure they're also in billions, right? Involve 3 nations, the United States, the UK, I think also France are involved, right? So these kind of tripartite agreements to nail Airbus or Boeing or Rolls-Royce and the way in which they're getting parts from overseas or engaging in extractive industry. The only way they really do it is to say, you come to us cap in hand, right? Tell us that you've been engaged in something which may or may not be bribery, but we're not going to go to court. We're not going to put you through the bad press, and we're going to agree to defer your prosecution. Otherwise, we're not going to do it. Deferred in the sense that if they don't pay the money, they don't do the things in the agreement, then we're going to prosecute them. But it never happened, right? Because the company, the advantage to the corporation is simple, right? We don't have to go through the court process. We don't have to negotiate that bad press. We don't have a criminal record against us. The executives can just like walk away from this sort of thing. So that's the way in which they've been able to do that. Non-slavery, climate disclosure, I talked a little bit about. Nature-related risks are the next thing in this space. So climate, making a corporation report on its climate obligations, whether or not they're stage 1 or stage 2 or stage 3, scope 1, scope 2 or 3 is one question. But the next question is also, well, how do you account for, report on, and hold to account commitments related to natural destruction, water use, biodiversity loss? So at the international level, there are accounting standards that are being developed. They've already been developed for climate. I think they just got developed for nature. And so you probably see corporations starting to take these on board, feeding them back through their accounts departments, and then more disclosure, more documentation, more and more documentation is the final result. So I'm sort of running out of time, so I just wanted to give a few examples. There's some really progressive, I suppose you call them progressive legislation in Germany, also in Norway. This kind of due diligence legislation up and down your supply chain. You need to make sure that you do the right thing with respect to these. I don't know the ins and outs exactly what the regulations say. In Australia, we've not moved that far, but I think we're kind of getting there. So some points to kind of cap it off. I know it was a bit of a weird journey, but that's a bit like ESG, right? ESG is a place where you put all those things up on the screen. What does this all mean? Like, it's all good and well to go to a talk from a corporation. They say, we're doing fantastic on these things, right? And then you scratch beneath the surface, you find we're not doing great on gender diversity and other aspects. So some of the things I was thinking I might recap this and help us shape a bit of a discussion. Mining faced a number of reputational and financial risks. We know that, right? Due in particular to its legacy practices. So it's already got a history across the world, 6 or 7 countries. Some of them are privately owned, some of them state owned. Increasingly, China in recent times state owned, where they've done the wrong thing. So if you've got a bad rap already, how do you change that around? And we talk about this in the article I got with Clement, because critical minerals is different from mining coal. The moral argument around critical minerals is, oh, we're going to solve climate change. So therefore it's okay if we come into your community and mine critical minerals because we need the lithium for our cars, so we can all drive Teslas. So different context, right? I mean, sorry, that's Australian sense of humor. Most of these are environmental and social. I don't think we've even scratched the surface of the governance issues. They're in the too hard basket for now. And when we're talking environment, almost all of it is climate related so far. Why? Because it's easy to account for. Not easy, but we have mechanisms. How much gas came out of there? Oh, yeah, scientists will tell you. How much water did you use? Oh, we can't tell you that. But then it gets more and more difficult the more you think it through, right? The social and the governance issues are the real difficult one in the space. Then a kind of broader contextual point, ESG is becoming more prominent and likely to affect mining industry, just like they affect other industries. Part of the push is going to come through trade, as I said, but also through capital investments and through the finance industries. They're just not going to invest in mining ventures that aren't able to demonstrate that they're at least not disclosing or keeping the boxes on people. ESG frameworks and disclosure practices have improved, but outside of the EU currently are voluntary, right? There's a push to make them set in stone in OECD countries. But again, it's really starting and scratching the surface of the climate change reporting and so forth. We haven't seen it go all the way through. We certainly haven't seen it talk about the interdependencies between or interdependent. So for me, I'm sort of looking at this notion of what I call regulatory convergence. So I'm sort of seeing this intersection between what the law says, what the law does, what it's supposed to do, how a law is supposed to operate in society, all those things, all those factors on the screen, and what we're asking corporations to do. Right? And it's kind of interesting because there's a bit of back and forth going on, but I can see it merging together. On the one hand, there's arguments from the corporations, which I think was the point we were having before, that they're saying we want guardrails, we want regulation. Why? Because it makes it easier for them to report and to tick a box. So you kind of get this push for technicalities around taxonomies. What does sustainability mean? Well, it means this. Okay, good. And we can say we've been sustainable because section blah 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 says this. So corporations are actually asking for a bit of that, which is unusual. We're asking for you to regulate us, right? That is not the way that corporations have acted in the past. We regulate ourselves or get away from it. Right? So we're seeing that kind of convergence between regulatory standards where they might develop themselves, but somehow or some non-profit organization or these kind of GRI, global reporting initiatives or other initiatives are then being sucked into a legal framework and used as the norm for reporting, right? So that's one sort of thing I'm seeing take place. And the other one is this interconnection between the international and the domestic. So if you look at, for example, the German or the Norwegian laws, or increasingly, even the proposal for the changes to the Australian laws, they've got to hang their standards, they've got to hang their hat on something, right? And that it appears like what they're doing is reaching into that international space to find, what does the ILO say? Okay, right. The International Labour Organization agreements say X, Y, Z on this. We're going to use that as our benchmark for best practice for labour standards, right? So you're seeing, what I can see is this kind of use by some domestic legislators, not all, right? We're only talking about particular countries, to sort of reach into these sort of international frameworks that already exist. And in some cases, corporations are actually reaching into these frameworks which are not part of their domain. So I'll give you a perfect example and then I'll finish. So the World Heritage Convention, right, which is my kind of area of past study. Conventions are signed by states, countries, right? Corporations have nothing to do with conventions in terms of obligations. But increasingly, we're seeing corporations say, we're not going to invest or we're not going to mine an area that's a World Heritage Site. So it's assistance with the state in implementing its obligations under the convention. But why? I mean, what's so special about World Heritage Sites? Why not other sites? But what I'm finding is interesting is the corporations are looking for standards to hold on to as well. And so they're reaching into international treaties. They're reaching into these frameworks that exist that are kind of, I don't know, might be in an industry space, and looking for something to say, this is the standard that we met, and therefore we're okay. Anyway, that's it. That's the kind of discussion I wanted to foreground with you. Thanks very much.
That's amazing. I think it's already generated conversations. And there are a few questions online, but I can start from here. From the room, if there are any burning questions before I go online. Who wants to? Yes. Okay, Barney, Esau, and then you please, your name? Anne, yes, and Anne. Yes, so Barney, please.
Two quick comment questions. Thank you. Those are really interesting. But on regulation, you mentioned that you took up complexity of proving things like corruption and that kind of stuff. But also these big fines. Why and is PRISM was never discussed in this conversation? I was believing that in England we have a big one in
No, no one ever spends time for it.
Yeah, they are fine. No one ever goes to jail. Yeah. And the fine actually billion is a lot, it's not a lot.
Yeah.
And then the second question is, I'm just curious, just as a comment you said at the beginning, to what extent is these issues of Australian public consciousness discussed the experts are aware of it actually well, which it's not really people that care about these issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll do with the second one first, because that's the easiest one. Yeah, they're just not engaged at that level, right? But I'll give you a comparison. If you go to Japan, so they've done some work there, and the concept like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, they have become mainstream in that country in a very bizarre way, to the extent that you see them in coffee shops and, average people in the street talking about it. They're not kind of academic content. Australia doesn't engage with that stuff. SDGs, we barely even report on it from a political level, let alone it's being part of the discussions in them. The ESG thing is I think the domain of business. So I say that I went to this summit last year with all the Australian top executives, and I'm sort of watching them on the captains of industry with fancy watches and all this sort of stuff. And they talk big game about ESG, massive game. I mean, the whole summit was about ESG, so makes sense. But the way they talked about it was not particularly academic. They're keeping it at that level of the, oh, this is what we do. I'll give you a good example. So one of them was talking about, this guy was like, we make wine bottles. And we're the biggest exporter of wine bottles in Australia. Australian wine, goes all. It's like previously we had a high emissions intensive process because it had to go through a gas furnace. Very, very expensive and all these emissions and so forth. Anyway, we decided to fix that by investing in an electric furnace. Much less emissions, and therefore, point of the story was like, and therefore they're doing great on the emissions thing. ESG is all fine, no would look. When you start scratching the surface, you got all the sand mining to the glass in the first place, right? Like things like that. Then you got all the social issues of alcoholism and drinking and so forth. But that's in the far too hard space, right? But the way in which business is perceiving these things is very much surface level sales, marketing, get picked up by the marketing team and transformed into something that works.
Well, where did the electricity come from? It's all very well it's electric because, well, if you get electricity from the coal mine, it's pointless.
Yeah. Exactly right. And you know, you think of empty numbers of there. Oh yeah, all good and well for Evan to talk a big game about environment. He's just flowing 10,000 miles to the UK to give a presentation. You know, like all these hypocrisies in everything we do, right? And I think as academics, we like thinking those things through. In business, which seems to me more about confidence and marketing and sales, and let's move on, and let's do the deal, and let's present it this way. It's a different game. I don't have time for that sort of discussion of the niceties, but I think they should. And your point about imprisonment is interesting. I mean, we have it in our legislation.
But that the threat would you pay this billion or we're going to pay?
Yeah, I mean, executive officer liability, I don't know the extent to which it rarely gets done for environmental crimes, full stop, right? On the context of bribery, I'm not so sure. But the whole point of those deferred prosecution agreements, we're actually going to charge you anyway. We're going to charge you, but there's a point at which we're going to stop going through the court process. So you don't have to face that. I wouldn't be surprised if it's in the Bribery Act that there is imprisonment, but it's usually an either or. It's usually like £10 million or 2 years imprisonment in the Tower of London or whatever it might be, you know.
Fair enough. Thank you. And so we had a question, and then you have a question now. You don't you? Yeah, but not yet. Yes. Now and yes. Yeah.
Just got a question. So sorry, I came in on the tail end, but when you talk, for example, about organizations, choosing not to, for example, extract minerals from a World Heritage site, lots of these corporations invest a hell of a lot of money in PR and corporate communications, to be part of that animal mass. And it's about good corporate citizenship, the perception of good corporate citizenship. Here we are, we're actually doing our bit, checking that box, and looking good to the public, but then obviously not stopping extraction elsewhere, as you say. Secondly, also, when you talk about countries, sort of going voluntarily to the international system, so for example, the ILO you mentioned as the benchmark of best practice, for example, with say, child labour. Again, isn't the inherent weakness of that system the fact that they have to volunteer? How can you make a mechanism like that out easy?
So, I mean, I think the accountability question is an interesting one. So that's the point about having teeth, forcing behavior change, right? As we're talking about before. I mean, I'm not an economist, but economists have the sort of the control of that space about behavior change. I don't know if they can do it at the organizational level, but the individual level, we kind of saw it through the pandemic, right? If you're not going to incentivize you to do the right thing, we're going to regulate you, right? You're wearing the mask or we're doing X, Y, Z, right? But there's everything in between. But in the context of your question about standards which exist at the international level and need to have some teeth, they need to be brought in terms of the writing of that particular standard into domestic legislation. I mean, that is the only way, not the only way. I mean, there are other ways of putting pressure on corporations through reputational things which you kind of alluded to, and shareholder resolutions and protest votes and these sorts of things. But the implementation of international standards in domestic legislation is where the rubber hits the road. And then you've got to have the willingness to enforce it and so forth. So what the difficulty is here in this space, I think, as well, is that we're dealing with different jurisdictions. We're often dealing with subsidiary companies as well. So if you've got a UK-based company, but they had a subsidiary that's set up in Ghana, is doing child labour, to follow that example, might be all good and well if the UK is, following a similar directive that the EU is going to put forward. But how does that flow through all the way through down to the supply chain? They might just have a disclosure point and that's the end of it. And then the point about teeth then becomes, well, did you disclose? Yeah, we did. And it ends there. So I think it's extra tricky when we're dealing with the separation of jurisdictions. But I mean, in the past, I suppose part of the reason why, these companies went into these places was purely because they had, regulations that weren't there. I mean, there's a horror story in the island of Tonga in the South Pacific, where this Canadian company, this was relatively recent, went to Tonga and they said, right, we found some nickel in your area. We really want the nickel. I think it was a Canadian company. And the King of Tonga said, okay, you can have it, but it's going to cost you X amount. They were good. Yep. Where do we sign? Where's the process? Oh, we don't have any laws for deep sea regulation, right? We don't even have any mining. We don't even have any laws for terrestrial mining. We've never done it before. But you can have the material. So pull that out of paper, right? The Kingdom of Tonga Trust and Top. You hereby get access to X amount of, basically wrote the links for it. So underdeveloped laws in a domestic sense in some of these jurisdictions is a big public problem. And then I don't know how to answer the more, how do we implement more strictly? If they are the standards that we want to use and are the best ones, then I suppose that's up to the individual governments of the day.
Okay, brilliant.
Here in the US, the cultural practice would be big companies will do things, the value of profits that are in New York, they'll regulate. But I think for a lot of companies, they actually want stable industrial policy and stable policy, so they can good companies. So they know what they can invest in, they know what the future products will be, they know what the returns will be, they can put in long-term investment plans for the next 10 years. It's actually a nightmare for most of them. Complete uncertainty about what the rules and regulations are going to be. So they're trying to guess what things are. And so I think that partly answers your question as to why some companies are looking to these international frameworks, was to say, here's an international framework which is being embedded into supranational laws, things like that. And maybe it's a guide as to where, the EU will be the first adopter because they're the leaders in these areas. So then it's a guide to the other countries. If we adopt this kind of approach, then at least we're going to be future ready and we can see potential opportunities. And I think it's the same reason why domestic legislation will look to implement international regs, because they're also trying to appeal to international conglomerates who have to comply with regulation in 50 countries. How in hell's ever going to do my annual report and accounts? They're going to deal with all these things. If I adopt a global standard, which is going to be a fairly high standard, then at least you've got sort of congruence across the reporting framework. So I think part of it is that. I mean, obviously there are always going to be the companies which only want to produce they look for the lowest labour costs and almost go and set up a factory there. There's always going to be that. But that doesn't help you if you're a miner, because a miner, you've got to go to where the actual stuff is. So I think it's not all companies are going to be bad, but what your solutions depend on whether you believe in a capitalist model in the first place, and what additional guardrails or restraints you think need to be imposed in order for it to work better for more people.
So taking, for example, an African country, Ghana, that's much like, but just off the top of my head. I mean, you also have to deal with the problem of capacity in terms of how these people write things into their law.
Yeah,
Because,
yeah.
right, exactly. And how does that happen?
It happens.
Does that give you confidence?
No, because a lot of the time, with the lack of, say, regulatory design capacity, you get regulatory capture occur, which is essentially the industry writing the regulations. The first player, the first mover there, sits next to the King of Tonga and says, yeah, no, I think you need a clause in here about, this, because that's the way we've done it in Brazil for the last 25 years. A similar situation, I think, took place in Ghana with lithium. It's the first mover. They get there and say, we found some lithium. So, right, well, that's all good and well. We need some, let's have an argument over royalties or discussion over royalties. But then we're going to mold the regulatory framework that happens at this domestic level. So you're getting this kind of capture of the decision makers and the laws as well.
Okay, it's fine. Please, and then you can come in later. And then there are a few questions online as well. Please go on. Yeah.
Bundled into a lot of trade agreements. And I think what that shows is that it's not necessarily that countries don't have strong regulatory capacity, it's like showing the fact that these international issues. So there's evidence of mining companies trying to sue governments and having chilling effects on big capacity states like Bribery and Netherlands. So yeah, I was wondering, because I know you talked about trade, but I don't think I've
No, I haven't gone down the rabbit hole of trade, not being a trade lawyer, but I can see the influence from the side. So that's the only point I was trying to make about it. But maybe it is another rabbit hole I need to go down. I think you're right. And an example is when our diplomats, whenever an international convention occurs, and the environment space. And Australia sends a delegation. I assume it's the same in the UK and other places. 3 months before the delegation gets there, it's the trade department that takes over all the discussions, and it becomes very trade focused in that sense. So, and you can see it. You can see them not agreeing to things on the basis of trade related issues. I just haven't explored that very much. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you. So you hold on with yours, right? Fantastic. There are a few questions online. The first one talks about from Shueke. Talks about high risk in mining activities and how Australian companies handle this over when they work in foreign countries. But I think you can take that and along with the question about are there measures put in place to protect mine workers from undue and prolonged exposure to air pollution and noise pollution that affect their lungs and ears? So this more around, and this is the question from Sion around protection of workers and everything. And maybe these two and then.
So I think it comes back to a couple of things. So I mean, at the operational level with a mine, how it works is broadly similar across the world, right? You go in, you find the deposits, there's an exploration phase. Then there's a testing of the commercial ability of those minerals, right? Like commercialization of them, like other the quality that we thought they were, right? And then there's a decision to go and get capital. So they go off to Singapore or one of the big, say, look, we found this. We know what to do. It's going to be viable. We've spoken to the local regulators. They haven't got anything yet, but we're going to set it up with them and it'll last for 20 years. Okay, here's your money, right? Phase 1 to get the mine off the ground, blah, blah, blah. If you're a big company like Rio Tinto, maybe you can do it without having that capital. But that's generally the process, right? Then they get to the negotiation stage. Usually there's 2 aspects. There's the tenure. So there's the right to access the land in the first place. But depending on who holds that, in some places indigenous places, so they have to negotiate with indigenous owners, which is what happens in Australia a lot of the time. In other cases, it's state-owned land. In a lot of the kind of British colonised places, there will be a notion that the minerals are the property of the Crown, i.e. the government of the place, right? It's the same in Australia, it's probably the same in UK, although in the big mining culture, which means that they can then allocate the minerals to the corporation directly, right? On such terms as they fit. Now, in return for royalties, and then usually you've got the conditions. So the question about mine workers and so forth will either sit in the conditions of the permit that they're being provided at a very local level, or, which is unlikely for places like Africa, I would assume, but I don't know, we've not done any particular research there. There's going to be a law that sits outside of that, which also protects the health of mine workers. Probably very unlikely, right? So if that outside law is not there, the health and safety of all mine workers, or there's a broader occupational health and safety law that's not there, then it's going to come back to the conditions of the permit. If it's in neither of those, then the individual may sue them in some form of common law, or damage to my my personal well-being and so forth. But I imagine those situations are few and far between as well. So from a legal sense, I anticipate that's how it works. I don't know from, it's going to be dependent on jurisdiction to jurisdiction as to what that looks like.
What sort of timeline is that? Sorry, can I just ask, what sort of timeline is that? Because the Foreign Affairs, House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee said that process can take between 10 to 16 years when it comes from making a full scale. You need a 6-fold increase in next sort of 10, 15 years in critical mineral supplies. Where do you see that sort of balance between we need to speed this process up in order to satisfy demand, but we also need to improve standards because there are very legitimate questions there. Is there a trade-off, or is there just a
Absolutely, there's a trade-off. I mean, and it is an economic imperative. We dig this up. We're dangling big money in front of your government, right? That's a hard thing to to refuse. And this is happening in the case of the South Pacific Islands, right, with deep sea mining. It's very hard to refuse the amount of money that's on the table. We don't have the regulatory framework. I will just borrow what the Solomon Islands had for their terrestrial mining. Totally different type of mining, totally different country, totally different constitution. This sort of borrowing from different jurisdictions and the piecing together of a quick regulatory framework and assuming that all the institutions are strong enough to enforce it and so forth. So I think you're exactly right. You get this trade-off, then you get this haphazard thing. I mean, regulatory systems you can think of as evolving themselves as well, right? Like it's tested, it's tried, it's not worked. This company got off scot-free, it's still not working in the UK. We're not sending enough people to jail. Let's start sending people to jail. The thing starts to evolve with the practice of the mining, right? And in the case of these kind of first mover places, it's very unlikely that I think is going to be the case. The first time around is probably going to be an absolute disaster for the country and the community, right? Or some members of the community may do very well, and others may do very poorly. So this is what happens in Australia in some situations. Some of the groups extract a lot of money out of the situation. Some of the landholders do. That's just the reality of it, while others don't. So the power dynamics that exist at the negotiations phase of it, which is around the tenure and the access to the license and the royalties and so forth, that part becomes really important. But I think your point's a really valid one. Like there is a trade-off there, right?
Yeah, and just to note, for those in the room, there will be lump set. I don't know why it's not in, but it should be in yet. So don't be worried in case you have. So there's still quite a number of questions on. There's a lot of interest online, which is fascinating. There's a question about from Munya, trying to look at what would you say is the impact of mining on companies, of the impact of mining companies in politics in Africa? I think you spoke about that in listening to Bribery. Someone asks how mining companies are willing to be regulated, even in Africa, as well. So you may want to take both together. So the question from Munya, both up and down there.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I don't know. I don't know. I suspect their systems, their legal apparatus is probably not up to scratch, whatever that means, right? Assuming there is some benchmark. And I'm assuming, again, I don't know, but I have read pockets of literature that the institutions are not capable of regulating this. There's going to be all sorts of issues with regulatory capture and bribery and so on and so forth. I mean, one of the interesting things that goes back to this last point is there is a choice about whether you engage with mining or not. It's not this kind of assumption that we just all go through with it. And that, the government of the day could say no. They don't, but they could. Right? And I think that needs to be on the table as well. I mean, if you look at a place in Latin America, like I think Ecuador and maybe Bolivia, very kind of ecocentric, environmentally friendly, even within the extent of their constitutions and so forth, where they refuse this high levels of extractive industry. Right? They don't want to base their economies on this notion of digging stuff out of the ground and therefore it creates wealth, for everybody in society. So those decisions can be made by the politicians today. It's just hard to get to that place. But yeah, I haven't done the work on that local level in Africa, but I suspect if I looked at the literature, it would set out so many examples of regulatory failure and so forth. There may be a couple of good stories in there, but sorry, just one last point. I remember reading a National Geographic article. I used to have a whole bunch of them. And I had the whole series. Went from all the way up to 2000. I went from 1979. And it was Africa. It was Africa's focused issue on Nigeria. And it said, and I was reading it, it's kind of a bit older, something, and it's like, Nigeria's got so much oil, right? Enormous amounts of oil, and it's gonna, if blah blah blah, I went through the whole article, and the last paragraph it said, however, if they can't get bribery, corruption, and all these other systemic issues, it's a potential to become the richest country in Africa, if not, and increases GDP through the roof. If they can't get this stuff under control, then it'll be a disaster. well, not a disaster, but words to that effect, right? And I was reading in 2006 going, well, it's very, very strange, you know, and the story of Shell in Nigeria is, you know, kind of well told one, right? But, you know, I don't certainly hold myself out as an expert in Africa, as I told you this, but all these countries are context specific, right? Even amongst Africa, I would assume there's a lot of diversity in the governments, the practices, the institutions, and so forth. Certainly the minerals.
So for some of those international mining companies, some of them will be held to account to a certain degree back in their home jurisdictions, won't they? Because some of them will have, they'll be subject to laws in, let's say, the Netherlands or the UK, which have extraterritorial application. And there have been a few more cases recently with different interest groups bringing cases against Shell, for example, in the Netherlands.
You're right. Yeah.
Some which have been successful and some which are still going through, which is a positive sign. It's terrible it has to go that way. But
Yes, you're right. Yeah, and I did have a point about that in the presentation, but I forgot to go onto it. There are countries, Canada also has similar laws. And I think there was a case in Guatemala with a Canadian subsidiary. That mining company, there was protests at the mine and the security guards came in and they basically shot the protesters and there was all sorts of horrible stuff that went on. And then a Canadian case happened in Canada against the parent company of that. So there are mechanisms. There's none, hardly any in Australia to hold such companies to account. The Americans, I think, have the Alien Torts Act or something like this.
Yeah, as well. So some of the FCPA stuff.
Yeah, a bit coming out, you've got the problems with the evidence, you've got the problems with, you know, who's done what. You've got this kind of legal questions about where's the right forum to hold a jurisdictional dispute as well. It's not easy. You know, there's a fascinating story of one in, no, it's in South America, and I think the company is, I forget the name of the company, but the guy wrote a book about it and there was a documentary about it. Has anyone heard of this story? It's fascinating. And so he was a lawyer in America, an American company trashed this place in Latin America. And he went down there, collected all the evidence firsthand, everything, back to America and tried to sue the company. Anyway, for whatever reason, he started writing, some documentary people got in contact with him and they were documenting his adventures to get the stuff out because they were going to release a documentary at the same time to try and punish this big corporate offender. Problem was, when it got to the court, they found out that he had done a documentary and they subpoenaed all the material from the documentary and it ended up bringing him undone. Oh, it's a fascinating story. I'll have to send it around. And the guy was, I don't know, a Harvard graduate and friends with the Barack Obama and all this sort of stuff. But it was a disaster because they tried to run the case and the documentary at the same time. But you're right, there are mechanisms depending on the country and the parent country involved and so forth.
Well, that's a bit animalistic anyway, isn't it? Because it's relying on some nice European country to have a law which then tells the other
That's right.
country is the way it usually.
Yeah, this is the way it should be done, you know.
Yeah, great. And there's a question here, but just before then, there's a question online that's asking about whether we think ESG rating can affect peace and security and how these ratings are done. And then.
Yeah, so there's rating agencies out there. There's different frameworks as well. So they use these frameworks. So Global Reporting Initiative, I think, starting 2000, something like that. So these are kind of, again, voluntary frameworks that you go through. And the companies sign up to them, and it's basically a series of questionnaires. And they go through the questionnaire, and at the end of it, they get some kind of certification or rating, and it puts it out there. And then investors make decisions based upon those ratings, and they market them and so forth. So, yes, they exist. What was the second part? Do I think they have any effect? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not in the investment space. So I was saying before, I think a lot of this exists largely out of the kind of academic critiques and looking deeper into this. I feel like it's very much in the space of business, how we market, how we sell ourselves to potential investors and so forth. It's in their interest to keep it at that high level.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned the case of Bolivia with the Aymara, who have now rejected who are in the process of rejecting extractivist processes. And I should point out that has to do with the history. Since in Bolivia, the Aymara like to say when Spanish extracted enough silver to build a bridge made of silver from Sea all the way to Spain. So there has been a gradual rejection based on indigenous esteem of extractivist projects because of the destruction to the environment and destruction to the Guatemala. I have to admit, as a Latin American, I feel like there's almost a lot of faith on corporations, and I know we in my own country have cases of we have a trial that we have against a Finnish company, and we did do it with restrictive jurisdiction. They were sentenced guilty, and they kind of just quietly left the country. So I also want to point out corporations as moral actors. As someone who's seen corporations be very immoral, makes me cringe. The EU portraying itself as like the landmark or the beacon of progress also makes me cringe because it's specifically Canadian, American, European companies, the ones that are kind of historically. We'll see what happens with China. I'm not going to say they're necessarily going to be different, but thus far, that is what our history tells us. That is what our legal precedents tell us. So I basically have two questions. One is with regards to, because there have been so many, how can I say, company abuses. I don't know if you're familiar with the ESG agreement. It's to protect land defenders, specifically indigenous peoples, who are often the first to denounce these abuses, the common environmental abuses, and that's because of they have a high death rate. And that made me think, what is the protection in Australia for whistleblowers? Is that an issue? Are indigenous peoples endangered when they protest these projects? And then my second question is that there's also been a push within the Inter-American Court, Safaroni is one of them, to try to establish ecocide as part of the Rome Statute as a crime against humanity. It would kind of solve this issue of having multiple jurisdictions. You now have companies that are very opportunistic where they set up their headquarters. It's usually the place with there's less regulation. And then all of a sudden you have headquarters in Cayman Islands and you have it. So, we need forensic accounting. In the case of Costa Rica, we require forensic accounting to know who to sue and where to sue. So there has been this push to try to establish ecocide as a crime against humanity. So I think those are my two questions. One, what is the protection for whistleblowers? Is there any specific consideration made for indigenous peoples? And two, do you think that climate change or crimes against the environment should be raised to the level of crimes against humanity?
So let's deal with the whistleblower one. I think the way we conceive of it, when you're talking whistleblower, are you talking someone who is within government blowing a whistle on practices of what the government is doing in terms of bribery, corruption, decision making, so forth? Or are you talking in the corporate context of someone who's working in a corporation?
So right now,
Or both?
the Escazú agreement is purposely very broad. It's basically anyone who's denouncing potential damage or destruction to the environment. It doesn't specify, what status or what role the person is playing. It's more the fact that they're denounced, and it's protection based on the fact that they're denounced. So in some cases, it could be a company employee, or alternatively, it could be a member of the local indigenous people that they be with.
Okay, yeah. So in my country, in Australia, the concept of whistleblower is very much aligned with public decision-making, public office, some sort of institution, as opposed to someone who's an NGO. That kind of feels to me about freedom of speech, protest, and so forth, rather than blowing a whistle on something, if that makes sense. So if you're talking about protection for both of those, so there is the protection for whistleblowers. We don't have, well, I'm not saying we don't have corruption, because we certainly do have corruption, but it's probably not at the same levels that it is in Latin America. I think that's probably, fair to say. So we do have protections against whistleblowers. As far as I've seen, it hasn't come up in the environment mining space from a government. I can think of one instance where somebody came out of a regulator and said, who was the person who was actually doing the assessment of the big it was coal seam gas, which is basically a coal bed methane project. And she was working in the department, and she came out and said, I was working in the department, we only got 2 days to look at the whole environmental impacts of this, and I was basically told just to rush it through. Right? She then had to go to their equivalent of the BBC, and blow the whistle through that avenue. There are other mechanisms that I can think of now that you remind me. There are ones where we have independent commissions against corruption, where if a mining lease is granted to somebody's mates or whatever from the minister, then the minister can be taken to the independent corruption, and the whistleblower person gives evidence through that proceeding, and it's about essentially prosecuting the corruption of and they get protected through that system. So that's the kind of more public system. In terms of, which is probably more where your question's headed, I suppose Indigenous people making a complaint about a particular mine, or raising objections or protesting, or anybody, right? Indigenous or non-Indigenous. That has come under recent scrutiny, I must say, in the last, say, 5 years. There have been some cases where protests will occur, they'll blockade the mine site, or go up the trees or whatever, and then you'll get a situation where the police are involved, and a question about whether the protest was legal or not, and the level of force and so on. But it's very kind of context specific. Then they usually get taken through the general criminal justice system, as if it was an assault or a public offence or something like that. So there's no specific laws and protections in that sense about it. In the Indigenous sense, it's, I think, a bit of a difficult issue, because as I was trying to allude to before, and we have 700 different Indigenous groups in Australia, right? They all speak, not all of them, but they speak different languages. They have different ways of engaging with the area. Some of them are listened to more than others, and they certainly don't agree. Right? So there's sort of the perception that there is kind of one kind of Aboriginal people in Australia, and they all get on, and it's like kind of us versus them is certainly not the case. So that complicates things even further. So the choice that a particular mining company may have to go to a particular group might be quite deliberate, in the sense that they know they're going to get a favourable outcome from a particular group and may not against another group. So there is some discussion at the moment. I was having a discussion with a friend on the way in about this, about improving the processes of engagement for Indigenous people. Right? And how do you actually identify who the appropriate group is or person is to engage with? So those things have been done poorly in Australia. And I'm assuming in Africa you may have similar issues. The question of ecocide, I have heard that theoretically from, I think, what was her name? Polly somebody several years ago. Yep. Polly Higgins, and she came out and gave excellent talks, and I was like, wow, this is 100% spot on. In Australian context, it's very hard to get these things any legal traction, and possibly that goes back to my point before, that we are very conservative legally. It's not to say it's impossible, and maybe some of the principles or thoughts that sit behind it, or indeed other more wild law type, rights of nature type approaches, can also be built into our system. And in some cases, I think they have been, but not to the same extent as this concept of Pachamama in Latin America. But I suppose what you're doing is you're creating another, not you, but if we did do that, it would be creation of another legal standard or framework. So it'd be playing within the existing legal structures, which may or may not be a good thing, right? And determining who defines the elements of that, and then it goes back through, and you work your way through it through the traditional processes we have of that are flawed to begin with. So this was one of the problems or discussions I had when we were talking about the referendum before, like the referendum in Australia we had about rights of Indigenous people. A lot of people thought it's all good and well to put a body in the Constitution that respects Indigenous people's views on particular issues, or gets them to have an elevated view, or whatever you want to call it. But that just plays within the existing system. So the existing power dynamics and the structures and all the problems that exist institutionally there continue to carry on, even if you are able to implement it, or at least to put it in place. So So yeah, I think you raised some fascinating points. I don't know if I have an answer to the eco side question. I would certainly like to see better enforcement and accountability. Whether they're government, corporation, individual, or yeah.
My name is Ian Johnson. I come from Johnson Partners. I'm actually based in Geneva, a master's at the Geneva Academy. And you raised some interesting points, especially when you reach the Nigerian situation. My question is the concept of patronage politics or neo-patronalism, and we cannot excuse the complicity of mining companies or wealth management consultancies in sort of entrenching quite a level of decadence and corruption in some of these places. But I'm fascinated that Nigeria is the multi-ethnic states. There are about 270 tribes, and based on patronage politics, it so happens that the government has to buy legitimacy from the people. So for example, you're from the south, or you're from the smaller tribe, to get into power, it's inevitable that corruption sort of helps you buy your way to power. And then, like I stated, it's the complicity of mining corporations or some of these international organizations. How exactly have you been able to solve that? Because I believe in Australia, it's like improved regulation, in as much as from all the ethnic states, from indigenous people. But I don't think you suffer this problem as much. So what exactly do you think has been the differentiating factor to ensure that you can bypass what we face, like patronage politics or neo-patronalism?
Well, that's a massive question. I think it's hard to compare, right? Like, I mean, the Australian situation has there's probably some similarities to some countries in Africa in terms of colonization of laws and so forth. So a couple of points, maybe on the rules side of things. The interesting thing is that the rules that I've seen, and I'm talking about the laws and the legislation that sit around mine, very similar in the kind of thought processes of how it's supposed to work, right? And that was the process I was talking through before about allocation of tenure. Somebody owns the land. Once we go through that process, we'll then get the permit. That'll give us a license to do that in return for extraction. So the logic seems to be similar. So we kind of got this, what would you call it? And that was all common law British developed, right? It's that system that has kind of been exported through the world. It's not the only system, and we haven't really decided to innovate or move away from that notion to begin with. And maybe back to her point about ecocide and these sorts of higher level concepts that sit about protection or no-go zones or whatever it might be within communities that don't even allow you to get to this sort of logic that there are natural resources available for our use and taking, and that the flow-on effect will be that you win because the royalties will go back to the state, and then they'll do the right thing and spend it on your behalf and improve schools and whatever, right? Like that's the prevailing logic. And I think it kind of makes us a bit maybe intellectually lazy if we just assume that that's the way that it should work. But yeah, I can't answer the specifics of your question about the jurisdiction you're talking about. But in an Australian sense, I mean, one of the big changes we had was recognition of land rights for Indigenous people, right, in the early 90s, which was a long time coming. And they'd had a couple of cases about it. And finally, they got through the High Court and said, yes, we will recognise special type of land rights for Indigenous people in Australia. But it exists within the structure of our common law system. So we're only going to recognise them to the extent that they're compatible with this common law system which we inherited from the British. So then you're playing within a structure where the rules have already been set in a way, if that makes sense. Yeah. So what they got was not necessarily, so he's going to say they, I mean, Indigenous people, if you have rights to native title, which is what it's called, right? It doesn't give you carte blanche and ability to do whatever you want with the land. It only gives you limited rights in relation to what you were doing with the land for the last 200 years before the English arrived. Insofar as you can prove that that's what you did. So if you always fished in the area, you're allowed to continue fishing in the area, but that's the extent of your rights. Not like these kind of US systems where you see, okay, well, they hand it back to the Native American group and then they decide to build another casino or sell it off or whatever, right? And now I'm just being, silly there, But that was one aspect, but it was a flawed process. And in many ways, some people have said, well, that actually wasn't what we needed to happen there to move Indigenous societies forward. But you've got to also remember, like the population in Australia for Indigenous peoples, and we were talking about this context before, is 2 or 3% of the population. The vast majority of the population are white people like me who live in the cities in affluent lifestyles and hardly ever encounter an Indigenous person. Right? Apart from when we walk to our elite institutions at Sydney University and have to go through this area called the block, where everyone's like, don't go on that side of the road. Right? Like, and that's the vast majority of Australians experiences, you know, as sad as it is to say, unless you go to the Northern Territory, in which case you see Indigenous people in flesh, so to speak.
Can I go some indigestion before lunch? So I just wonder what your views are about John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, in which is centralized the fact that these companies don't just kind of, in a sense, extractivist institutions. They're actually backed by, in some cases, say the United States government. And it says, for example, that when Washington, sees an area in a certain third world country, Chile, wherever, and it's got minerals that they covet, they basically send out representatives and say, look, listen, it'd be really nice if you could allow Texaco to come in and have the rights to do whatever. And if the president refuses, then they send back another person and say, look, listen, I've got $200 million check, and I've got a bullet with your name on it. Take your pick, you can send your kid to Harvard, they can go to MIT, whatever, all bills paid. If you just accept this, you've got 200 billion, you're sorted for life. And if you still resist, then he says they bring in what they call CIA sanctioned troublemakers to destabilize the government. And if that fails, they bring in the US Army. What do you think about that? I mean, is this all a losing battle that there are these forces at play?
I would not be surprised if there were broader geopolitical issues going on in terms of decisions to make. And I mean, a perfect example is the supply chain arguments that are happening now around sustainable or critical minerals, right? Australia has some, I forget the percentage, but some amazing percent of lithium, right? We don't have the capability, sorry?
So much, yeah.
So much, right? We don't have the capabilities to turn it into batteries, right? So there's some big talk on the radio that they go, oh, we need to do this, right? It's all about, not all about, but a large component of it is control of the supply chains, who we deal with and where. And you can see that I think what that's, the rich person's club, the rich countries club, the OECD, are kind of moving in that direction. Our comparative advantage in this space is that we're all wealthy countries. We all do things by the book, and all our companies do things by the book. If you want to go off and do business with China or Russia or somewhere, you go for it. But we are up here, right? And maybe this is what the EU is also doing, right? In terms of comparative advantage and so forth. But I would absolutely take your point that I wouldn't be surprised at all if there were broader forces at play in decisions where to go and the kind of strong arming of certain, probably history is littered with these types of examples.
There are a few questions I'd like to probably take them. And then one from Eka is asking what the role of regional frameworks or organizations to support the development of necessary regulatory frameworks are. So basically, yeah, if national government don't have capabilities or interests, what about regional organizations? Obviously, talking about Australia, for instance, can't play a role, to parachute into the destination countries. That's using domestic laws for international affairs, but regionally.
Maybe try and rephrase it again, the question. Sorry, I'm just not following it.
He said he's interested in the role of regional frameworks to support the development of necessary regulatory frameworks.
Okay.
To have a stronger base for negotiation.
Okay, so when you're talking regional frameworks, I mean, in an Australian sense, we have no idea of what regional framework is.
Yeah.
When you live in Europe, you have an idea of regional framework, right? You've got this mother organization of the EU, not anymore, but telling you what to do and what not to do and directives and so forth, right? In an Australian context, we don't have that.
Yeah.
We have international law and that's it. And then there's our domestic law.
You're not a member of any regional court.
No.
Something like the Inter-American Court.
No. We do our own thing. Rightly or wrongly. I don't care, we've got trade relationships, right? We're part of ASEAN and these sort of, economic cooperation organizations. But there's no, as far as I'm aware, Inter-American Court equivalent, right? We don't have this regional, what would you call it, supranational level of law and politics to deal with going back and forth. It's international law, domestic law, and that's it. Having said that, we do have a complexities with the state-based system in terms of federalism, which the United States, Germany, and Canada, and a few other nations have, right? Because the states got there first. So we have this sort of distinction about what the federal government can and can't regulate for. But when it comes to international frameworks, if Australia has signed an international treaty, it allows the federal government, that is the Commonwealth government, to regulate in that space. That's the general rule. There are other powers as well, but that's the one that they seem to regulate most on. So, but whether they do it or not is a different question. So, for example, are we signatories to the ICCPR and ICA? Of course we are. Do we implement it in our national legislation? No. Right? We don't have a Human Rights Act that says here are all your human rights, exactly like they are in there. We have bits and pieces that refer to it in various places, but it's a choice that happens after the treaty is signed, whether politically we legislate for it. So one of the big questions in the space of Indigenous Australians, mining, extractive industry, land use at the moment, is this concept of free, prior, and informed consent, which some of you may have come across. So if you look at the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, there's two provisions that talk about free, prior, and informed consent. Free, prior, informed consent. So obviously freely, you can't pay someone for the use of their resources. Right? Must be prior. You can't just extract it and then go back after them. Must be informed. You must give them adequate information, and it must be consent. So it must be an ability for them to say no. Now it's the last one that causes all the problems for countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States that have Indigenous populations, because they don't want to give over that level of consent. Consent is very closely aligned with sovereignty and the ability to say no, veto power, right? Yes, we'll consult. Yes, we'll tick a box. Yes, we'll ask you. Yes, we'll compensate you. But we're not going to give you the right to say no. That's the line that we don't want to cross. So coming back to the point I was trying to make, so there are some sort of murmurings that Australia should entrench that notion, but I just can't see it happening politically. And they would have every ability to, because they've, agreed to the United Nations Declaration of Rights on Indigenous People after first refusing, right, along with the United States and New Zealand and probably Canada. And albeit it's a declaration and not a treaty, but I think there'd probably be enough there for them to do it. But
yeah, I mean, Barney, you didn't have a question. Are you?
If I'm allowed, is that time?
Yeah, we still have about 20 minutes. Like,
I guess quick on if I may, I was just wondering, especially you talking about, business mining. So are any of the discussions and interest in ESG now being a bit cloudy by, I don't know if there's any kind of wow, things, even nasty challenges and think about business, pension and stuff, do you know what I mean?
yeah.
Is it any narratives like that?
Well, I sort of remember you went in the room before. I was sort of suggesting that there's this sort of comparative advantage argument coming on. That we do business in a way that is reputable and credible, and this is how we do things because we've got frameworks. The rich person's OECD club, right? And the interesting, like the whole work on bribery, which actually is an OECD convention, right, from the 1990s. There was no country in the world, and this is fascinating. I didn't know this until I was reading it last year. There was no country in the world that had foreign bribery laws until the 1980s. So I mean, foreign bribery as in someone who does something overseas and comes back to the keeper. Then the US under the Carter administration decided to implement, what do they call it? ECO or something like that, right? It's got an acronym. In the 1980s, mid-1980s. There was some big affair, I think with Lockheed Martin, one of these companies, something like that. So all right, we need to do it. Why would they regulate their own business? It doesn't make sense. You're regulating yourself, and this is what the way I was thinking of it. But then increasingly through their work with the OECD, they've got other nations to sign up to this bribery convention. Right? So now 37 of the richest countries in the world, Australia, UK, US, Finland, all the world countries, all sign up to the anti-bribery convention. And they've got really effective, or I don't know about effective, but there's certainly detailed mechanisms for accounting for who's implemented what under that convention. Right? You go to their website, they're like, status of Australia in implementing the OECD bribery conventions. But where it looked like it all headed was that these countries are trying to, one argument is, assume some form of comparative advantage over other countries. We can differentiate ourselves from them on the basis that our business model is forthright, it's anti-corruption, it's by the book, these are ideals which we hold dear. Now, whether that works or not with the individual players, I don't know. And whether they also talk the talk, in terms of people putting corporate people in jail, is another question altogether. But certainly that's the impression, the marketing that's trying to happen. And I do wonder if it's all part of that game. I mean, the Americans don't regulate themselves on anything. If they want to walk away from an international thing, they do it. So there must be something in it for them.
Is it just sort of a trust social contract being to help support the capitalist economy? Because if you're too egregious, then actually after a while, public support for something like that will start to disintegrate. So you can trigger this off the foot.
Yes, I that's where I'm sort of thinking it might go. I mean, there's underlying all of this is this question of legitimacy, right? So what does it mean to be a legitimate actor in society today? Right? Well, how do I get my legitimacy from the fact that I got some fancy, or not even fancy, semi-fancy degree from some, people are concerned with legitimacy. Organizations are concerned with legitimacy. If you're a government, you pass legislation, you don't really need legitimacy because you've automatically got it by the fact that you are democratically elected, right? Assuming you're. If you're a corporation, how do you build that legitimacy in order to exercise authority? So those two concepts are connected. And so I do kind of agree with you. I think it's kind of more sinister and strategic than perhaps not, which is I don't know whether that's unfortunate or not. I mean, they look like all good things. Like I'm a Western, educated person. I look up on that sounds great. I think we should improve gender diversity. I think we do need to, so they all look good. The wish list looks nice, but I'm just wondering about, the key question of implementation and progress. And I mean, measuring that is a whole different ballgame as well, right?
But it also helps if you build the hospital, the mining area, and name it after your company for the operation.
Yeah.
There's a long way. Schools.
Yeah, before you respond, I'm not sure how much more we can get the room. I know the book can make to primary state. The kickers are to you. But maybe you can ask a question.
Well, yeah, well, it's an observation, and perhaps I'll just chip in a quick question. So, ESG issues, they sort of permeate industries. Not long ago, there was a parliamentary inquiry set up to look into sustainability and fashion. And it appears that the self-regulatory nature of ESG happens to be the actual fields. That is inviting more and more government intervention, the government regulation. For example, the EU introduced the EPR, that's the extended producer responsibility. That basically says that no longer can fashion brands sort of act remotely from their waste, textile waste, apparel waste that are often dumped in third world countries, developing economies in Africa, etc., that have to literally move this responsibility front and center of their operations. How does this very problem of self-regulation, like these companies literally almost reporting on themselves, the fact that it's inviting more and more government, what do you call it, intervention. What does the future of ESGs look in a world where there seems or there appears to be more and more regulations by government? What does it mean? What outlook? What does it look like for ESGs in corporations?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. I mean, how it's unfolding at the moment is very much disclosure based, which is only the front end of the thing, right? We're going to force you to report on what you're doing, whether it be in fashion or in mining or in so that's a certain technique, right? It's an approach, right? So that's the first point to make. Whether it goes the next level. I mean, having said that, when you scratch a little deeper on some of them, they're not just report on the risks. It's not as simple as that. Report on how you're managing those risks as well. So it does at least try to go to the next level of risk management. It's that's the first point, right? At the moment, whether it goes any further than that, I mean, that's the big question. It might just continue down that rabbit hole of disclosure and tightening the rules around it. You need to give more and more and more information so we can make decisions. But the logic it's based on is the second point. It was set out by the head of the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States. I was listening to him talk, and he goes, look, for a long time in the United States, the last 100 years since we had the stock exchange, this has all been about information to the shareholder or to the investor. So they have all the available facts so they can make the best possible decision about where they invest their money. And I go, okay, well, if that's long been the dominant paradigm of how stock markets and monies and so on so it flows throughout the world, which is really what's sitting behind this, right? Like we can step back from mining and think about it as the flow of capital across the world. Then it's really about disclosure. You know, are you aware? And it's the same when you think about consumer protection. You know, are you aware? We put the label on the bottle. What's the problem? You know, we told you it's a recyclable bottle. Or in the case of fashion, we told you it's come from here. You make the decision. So it's kind of on this, that's the logic that seems to be the dominating logic, at least in a Western sense. So I think that's where it'll continue to head. Now, in the terms of regulation, I think you'll see tighter controls around the language. So for example, in the finance space, the development of sustainable taxonomy. I never heard the word taxonomy in my life until 2 years ago. I'm like, what the F is a taxonomy? So I Google it and it's like, taxonomy is like, you know, fancy name for the dictionary or glossary, right? And I'm like, this term means this. And so for the bean counters, the accountants in all these big organizations, they now have something to measure it against, which is where it's all come from, right? Because it's about reporting. It's about accounting for something. Normally they account with facts and figures, and now you need to do non-financial reporting. They're like, well, how the hell do we do that? Well, our training's been on there. Okay, well, here's the method. Well, that's a good method, but what does that mean? Here's the taxonomy.
That greenwashing too, right?
Right? Here's all the things you need, right? You know, here are the tools for the accountants to continue the corporate game, right? So it continues down that path. So I think in terms of regulation, that is responding to that play out. And, you know, in individual countries, for example, Australia, we just take that view from the EU with some slight tweaks. Like the UK, like our bribery, we introduced new bribery act, new bribery offence. It's a failure now to not take reasonable steps to prevent bribery in another country. That take it to the next level, right? All good and well. We basically copied it from the UK. It was almost identical to the provision of the UK. And this type of like lazy thinking about what regulation is or should be. We don't have time for that. Let's just take it from there and plug it into our context. And to your point in the report, there's no reason why we can't think about new regulatory approaches. There might not need to be regulatory approaches. They could be incentive-based. They could be principles-based. They could be culturally based. I don't know. I mean, effectively, you're talking about behavior change, right? Which is why I go back to the economists and how they rule the world. That, you know, how do you change someone's behavior? You don't have to regulate them out of existence. You can incentivize them. right? You could educate them. There are all sorts of different ways of changing behavior or combination thereof. So it's often thought of in the governance space as a policy mix. So what's the best policy mix for that particular problem? And in fashion, it may be different from mining, it may be different in different contexts as well. But we don't, I mean, part of the problem is in the academic space, and whoever's in this space will know, we just don't have the empirical work done. There's a lot of theoretical work done. The empirical work done is like the hard, the hard stuff, going out and talking to people and figuring out, well, did that actually, it hasn't been done. We've barely scratched. I mean, in some areas it has, but in a lot of these spaces, we've barely scratched the surface of it. So how can you make claims if you haven't done the empirical stuff? You just kind of talk around in circles. I don't know why more people don't get sent to jail. If they do, then let's track it and see if they change their behavior. Go and interview them on their way out of the clinic. Would you do that again? You wouldn't, would you? But anyway, these are all really big and fantastic questions, and yeah, I really appreciate having the time to have the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you don't agree with me that Evan has really kept the conversation going, both online and in person. And those online, really thank you so much for your time. Evan will be here with us till Friday, I think. Yeah, in London, July. So if anyone wants to pass by the office to have a conversation, please do. But yes, thank you so much. I can't attempt a summary because I think I've distorted the whole conversation. So please have a good afternoon and thanks for coming. Really, we don't take your time here for granted. And see you around for lunch. Please let's grab some wine, some food, and have a good afternoon. Yeah, those online, please take care. Thank you so much. Bye.